I'm now welcoming Amy Bauer. She's associate professor at the University of California, Irvine. She's the author. Well, she's a Ligeti scholar, so there's a trend in this panel over Ligeti. So she published Ligeti's Laments and an edited volume on Ligeti's cultural identities. She's as well as some of you of us know well, currently editing the Oxford Handbook of Spectral and Post-Spectral Music, along with Liam Cagney and Will Mason. And she will talk about the third generation Milano school. No, she will talk about Mauro Lanza and Andrea Valle. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. Over 4 years, Mauro Lanza and composer-technologist Andrea Valle composed the cycle Systema Naturae, 2013 to 17, which combines acoustic instruments with computer-controlled mechanical sound objects. The composer's manifesto is clear, quote, to create and explore a middle ground where mechanized objects can be controlled in a standard, even if basic, musical way, while music instruments are treated in an object-like fashion by means of a wide usage of extended techniques, end quote. The four works that comprise Systema... Can I grab a water?
Sure, I take it for you.
The four works that comprise Systema are inspired by medieval catalogs, Bestiaire, Herbaria, Lapidaria, and the later systematic description of the natural world found in Carl Linnaeus's original Systema Naturae. Lanza rewrote 5 movements of Regnum and Animale, the first work in Systema, as the basis for Anatra digeritrice, Piccola Wunderkammer di automi oziosi for orchestra in 2014, inspired by the 18th-century inventor Jacques de Vaucanson's duck automaton Canard Digérateur. This paper will analyze 3 of those 5 movements in their orchestral recomposition, arguing that in both works, spectral harmonies reflect the ambivalence of this mechanical-acoustical hybrid, and take pleasure in its failure to replicate the polished sheen of a conventional, digitally composed or notated composition. Many of Regnum's movements begin with a promised periodicity that never materializes, while Anatra appears as a, quote, little collection of precision-made mechanisms that move about pointlessly, end quote. Thus, Lanza and Valle's combination of spectral harmonies with computer sound processing techniques replicates the automaton's central contradiction. They highlight the pointed clash between precision and chance in nuanced ways that display the allure of technology's flawed analogs of the real. Regnum and Animale surrounds a string trio with a circle of computer-driven electromechanical devices, whimsical creations that offer a second life to discarded consumer electronics, such as knives, radio clocks, hair dryers, and turntables. The small pieces that comprise each cycle receive fanciful quasi-Latin titles and binomial nomenclature, the better to characterize their dependence on specific acoustic-electric hybrid combinations and patterns, within a universe of like objects and similar short lifespans. They represent 6 families that seem to reflect the original 6 of Linnaeus. The first work, Regnum and Animale, features 28 short pieces, the longest is 48 seconds, that unite a string trio, as mentioned, with various combinations of 25 electronic assemblages. The composer's homage to 18th century scientific taxonomies does not end with the name of each piece. They classify each object according to an augmented Hornbostel and Sachs system that accounts for mechanical features, control behavior, pitch versus non-pitch sounds, time responsivity, and control technology. The composition of Systema Naturae further subverts historical norms in that it involves 2 individuals who share duties that include instrumental construction, algorithmic composition, architectural and formal protocols, trial and error experimentation, and long-distance collaboration. Audio files generated by the sound bodies and instruments serve as basic compositional materials. They're analyzed for spectral data and generate sound body scores that both control events and which are themselves fed back into the larger algorithmic compositional environment. Sound samples representing both the sound bodies and the acoustic instruments provide a simulation, which subsequently generates, again, music notation and another sound body score. Although the sequence of the 28 pieces in Regnum may appear random, a serial permutation determines animal placements among pieces, and the entire work divides into two parts related by the golden mean. The score is very explicit about performance practice and includes instructions for pad-affixed strings and specific tempos. The rigor of this process can be gleaned from Lanza's discussion of his procedures in a lecture delivered at IRCAM in 2013. Lanza typically begins with a harmonic skeleton, using procedures such as ring modulation in pursuit of a quote-unquote logic of chordal proximity, based on an artisanal function that weighs the relation between any two chords. His algorithm calculates the proximity of partials sounded by any two clusters, determining the relation based on a comparison of their respective spectra. Such a harmonic process, as Lanza avers, can be riddled with creative errors. Similarly, every performance of Regnum and Animale will be different. As Valle notes, part of the aesthetics with the use of rumentarium, or residual orchestras, entails the hazard that jerry-rigged mechanical objects will break down or malfunction. Refabrications are part of a larger attempt at sustainable design and an instrumentarium in a state of constant becoming. Regnum Animale thus represents a paradoxical combination of ideals. The composers demand extreme rigor from themselves and their performers. Yet both composer and performer blend their efforts with the contingent sounds and rhythmic qualities of found and discarded consumer objects. This ambivalence is engineered into the work at a structural level, as shown by a close reading of Ioris Kasakochi, number 11 from the cycle. Ioris resembles a clumsy drunken dance, whose lumbering rhythm is articulated by an inaudible tune in cello, F sharp 3, B3, D sharp 4, articulated with a crase, on a fourth string tuned a minor 6 lower. The entrance of a low E1 played pizzicato in cello anchors the dance with a bass line, yet also doubles for the low hum of an electronic circuit, as if all the players were members of one fitful machine. The harmonic unfolding of Ioris juxtaposes a sequence of chords in violin, viola, cello, and one harmonica, a harmonica attached to a hairdryer. The melody establishes a four-chord phrase that quickly telescopes in length, and as the chords expand in density. The alteration at the violin's first notated pitch, F sharp 4, produces a spectral chord, whose elements are identified in a chart that prefaces the score as E4, C sharp 5, and F eighth tone higher 4. 4 bars later, the violin interjects a double stop on one open and one pad-affixed string, harmonizing the cello's E1. Each repetition of the cycle adds a stop to the upper string's harmony. A dyad becomes a trichord, tetrachord, and finally a pentachord. Each note sounded by violin and viola plays a role in the E1 spectrum, is listed in the table above. Yet the overall harmonic content seems to relate to the rich spectrum played by harmonica 2, tuned to G sharp 4, E5, B5, and E6. The most prominent partials performed by animals appear in table 2, this table. The notes not part of E1 spectrum are shaded in gray, so most of the notes occupy some part of the spectrum. In this next slide, I have two sonograms. The bottom compares a draft of the animals track, and again, he calls the little objects animals, of Ioris, created with digital samples, with a live recording of the piece that includes strings. That's the above spectrum. Red lines indicate points where the cello's E1 attack is supported by a rich spectrum on E in harmonica and seggiato, an electric knight set to excite a cymbal or metal plate, and lampadini, a switch that turns a light on and off. These sonograms also hint at the harmonicity and pseudo-regularity of the mechanical instruments, a framework muted in the recording of the live performance by the sustained noise elements in cello. For instance, the Lampadini's metallic attack generates an E major spectrum with a hint of the major seventh, adding a subtle glow to the conjoined attacks in armonica and segoppiato that marks the end of the first four phrases, quote unquote. A diagrammatic time notation chart of the microcontrolled animals reveals regular repetition of the same attack point durations distributed among the 12 animals. Something of this irregular periodicity is captured by the chart of an instrumental in animal attacks. What I did was just kind of very painstakingly, because it's all in microseconds, try to figure this out, so it's not exact, but you get the idea. As the period condenses and more animals fill in the gaps between the strings cantus, the dance becomes more agitated until the razzoio, an electric shaver in a metal box filled partially with buttons, enters to mark the final cadence. Adios Girardi, number 14, is a charming dance of percussive sounds dominated by individual fortissimo e crasi tones and strings, marked abrasive to resemble the radio, and sforzandi pizzicati. The instruments are accompanied by a huge battery of objects: molotare, armonica, two seggioppiato, a spremo agruma, a juicer featuring a low-pitched rumble, and all three radios, cadenced by the ring of the meshugello. A rhythmic chart demonstrates the growing density and frequency of attacks as the piece draws to a noisy close. Glissandi strings dominate Uro Foturonta Glistrispus, number 25, punctuated regularly by 3 molotari, 3 zampogni, and 3 girodisco, a low-quality self-amplified turntable set to produce a gliding sound as it speeds up and slows down a 33 RPM disc of string repertoire. The chords of the zampogni penetrate the dense spectrum that results. Zampogno 1 plays a third and major seventh over a raised C5. Zampogno 2, the sharp fifth and 11th over a raised C-sharp 5. And Zampogno 4 plays C-sharp, G-sharp 5, raised E6, and raised G. These works raise two obvious questions. First, what is the relationship between the robotic objects and traditional instruments? And two, how do Valle and Lanza's methods critique the traditional division of labor, the composer as autarkic and heroic, in Valle's words, by relying on a constant feedback loop? Regnum Animale could be seen as an exemplar of recent actor network and object-oriented philosophies in which humans and non-humans are viewed symmetrically, coexisting together in a flat ontology in which neither holds hierarchical sway over the other. Human intentions are mediated by the programming of the animals, within a structure both limited and directed by the sounds the objects produce. But instruments also mediate the performance of the animals to produce a hybrid work that harkens back to the early modern era the work playfully cites. Lorraine Daston and Catherine Park note how Enlightenment wonders of art and nature embodied a form of symbolic power, one augmented in the naturalist collections of marvels and the Wunderkammer. Within this economy of astonishment, their violation of the boundary between art and nature illustrated an aesthetic of virtuosity. Such collections, quote, gloried in superfluity, careless of function, and extravagant in expenditure of labor and materials. And nature approached art when her workmanship approached playfulness. Wonder once again ensued from the convergence of opposites, end quote. The lovingly assembled animals of the Regnum evoke such superfluous items, but they also reference those objects that overcame this simple convergence, early hybrids of art and nature that defied that formal division while highlighting both their artifice and that of nature itself. The artisan who fashioned automata strove to imitate nature, while those aspects of nature that resembled painting or sculpture were singled out, much as the natural strings become one with their mechanical adversaries. There's also a glorification and critique of both consumer waste and the fetishism of instrumental sounds. The 5 sections of Anatra digeritrice are each based on a work in Regnum and Animale. Anatra further spectralizes its source material, a very specific collection of mostly semi- and quarter-tone pitches, as in Regnum, present as higher overtone of central pitches. But Anatra also makes use of inverted spectrums and quasi-symmetrical arrangements around a central pitch. An indication of how this works is shown by a pitch inventory of Anatra's second section, based on Eoris Casacochi, in measures 36 to 58, shown above. So the staff shows an inventory of pitch classes in this section, along with actual pitches. The interval between adjacent pitch classes is indicated in cents. Those intervals in parentheses don't actually appear in the music, they're just up there for reference. The unambiguous fundamental E here appears in 5 octaves, while prominent notes of the E spectrum appear in 4 octaves, often linked to specific registral positions. This section shows a marked transformation from its generating piece. The prominent E in the bass reminds one of Griset's Les Espaces Acoustiques and links back to Eoris. Eoris generated more noise elements than pitch tones. In Anatra, the Acrese melody becomes a heterophonic chord progression, orchestrated in flutes, clarinet, bassoon, horn, and strings. A slow tempo, quiet dynamics, and muted tasto strings produce a dreamy, submerged sound not unlike certain movements of Ligoti's 60s works. The melody and flute more clearly expresses E, buoyed by harmonies that suggest a D and F spectrum, with ominous C-sharp in the bass. The phrases become shorter before fading off into a fuzzy cloud over F-sharp, dominated by overtones on C-sharp and G-sharp. As Anatra continues, it appropriates more of the sound world provided by the animals of Regnum. The first section represented a rousing dance for full orchestra, punctuated by humorous asides and wah-wah trumpet and a battery of tuned and non-tuned percussion. In the muted second section, you heard pitch percussion, harmonica, and a desk bell replicate some of the animal's sound world. But the third section begins with the tuba zigrinato, paired with small metal maracas, filling the space between attacks of an 11-note chord, which itself is accompanied by a string coil. The fourth section of Anatra enters fully into the spirit of the mechanical. The first attacked a 10-note chord that includes tasto strings, flotando flute, and wah-wah trumpet, summons the Acrese strings and multiple animals of Adios Girardi. This section features 16 variations on this 2-chord progression, one that, despite its dense appearance, rocks back and forth on audible D and F fundamentals. Repetitions of this progression draw out and elaborate it to create breath-like phrases ornamented with noise elements, stuttered rhythmic patterns and articulations, and upper partials, as shown by a comparison of the initial progression you just heard with its 15th iteration. So that was measured 91, and 15th iteration is at measure 120. The fifth and final section composes out the string glissandi in multiple motors, scratching and gliding record players, whistles and bells of Urfoturanta glistrispus. The entire percussion battery is employed, tuned cowbells, sirens, and slide whistles, glissandi on the marimba's resonators, along with multiple articulations in winds, brass, and strings. Once again, there is a clear periodic phrase anchored by two chords and winds, here answered by strings in a kind of call and response, as indicated here by a reduction of the first phrase. Again, the complex harmonies express fundamentals related by a third, here G and B. But as this phrase picks up more gliding and stuttering elements, the latter in winds, piano, and strings, it breaks down precipitously on its way to the coda, ending in a flurry of entropic energy as the digesting duck winds down without fanfare. The failure of the original La Canard Digérateur, the defecating duck, did not really process its feed, paradoxically crystallized its fascination for both contemporary and later audiences. But that fault highlighted the central identity of automatons as defined by Min-Soo King, a contradiction in the delicate balance between nature and artifice that flaunts its own insoluble paradox. How do we situate Anatra in this respect? In a sense, it digests parts of Regnum and Animale to produce something both new and gloriously old at once. Our reference point shifts from medieval taxonomies to the automatons of the Enlightenment. The earlier works are refashioned as movements of a Baroque dance suite, with each subsequent section appropriating more of the mechanical animal's sound in an orchestration that imparts a sense of depth and grandeur to the whole. Lanza stated his affection for the, quote, golden age of the automata, where the hoax and the genuine invention, the circus-like trick and the systematic investigation seem to coexist without apparent contradiction, end quote. As Regnum brought the flawed sounds of discarded objects to a chamber music stage, Anatra performs a similar trick by transforming actual automata into that most deceptive machine, the modern orchestra. It elevates those sounds as models for its own glorified, precision-made mechanisms, made all the more thrilling for their clumsy grace. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amy. So we have time for questions. Fred Salis.
Thank you, Amy. When you're presenting or when you're studying and analyzing Regnum Animale, are you presenting, studying, analyzing the work or a performance of the work?
Both. So I have a score of the instrumental parts. I have the kind of charts that describe in microseconds how the animals come in. I have, Mauro sent me the files, the digital files that he used as models, and then I have a recording of a performance. So I'm kind of going back and forth among all of those things.
But
Yeah, sure.
But doesn't the work get lost in the aleatoric gesturing of the non-controlled instruments? I mean, and if that's the case, why bother with the work? Why not just analyze the performance that you happen to have?
Because of the feedback loop way it was composed, in which the animals were recorded, and then that information from the spectral analysis of that was fed back to create the score that the instruments would play. So in a sense, I could just analyze the performance, but I'm also trying to get a handle. This is the most difficult thing I've ever done, so I'm not I'm not surprised if it's confusing to you. It's confusing to me, but I'm trying to capture somewhat of the process by paying attention to everything.
Okay.
I don't know how else to answer it. I mean, I could just deal with the performance, but
It seems to me that the work concept here is kind of a hangover from the 19th century that isn't really necessary. But, you know,
but
that's
the
what
score is so explicit.
Yes, but it's only part of the piece. And there is a sort of non-predictable element that will change from performance to performance, right?
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Anyway, thank you.
Thanks, Amy. It reminds me a bit of Maurizio Cagel's work, like Zweimann Orchestra, which is actually, in some ways, a lot more aleatoric in some ways. But just the general mischievous, creative attitude rings a bell, and I just wondered if there's any connection there, or what you thought about that.
Not that I know of. I've been very focused on just kind of absorbing Lanza's work and figuring out how he and Valle work. But I think you're onto something. Yeah. I mean, one could kind of create a. It's also part of a bigger issue I have that Kagel, I think, gets lost, at least in North America, in a lot of histories of new music, and that his influence is much more important than a lot of studies give credence to. So, yeah, I think one could definitely create a kind of a history of the quasi-mechanical in music, or the kind of feedback between, not just, I mean, there's a lot of people working right on the electronic studio acoustic instrument connection, but not so many on this kind of
Well, it's also a humorous, mischievous way of interacting. It's not just all, mechanical things. It's specific.
Yeah, and also the thing that strikes one when you watch, there's a wonderful documentary with Kagel on Vimeo, when, if one writes off, oh, he was just this music theater, you see how absolutely precise he is when he rehearses and everything. So there's that same combination of precision and, things happen. You can't control it all.
Thank you, Amy. Is there a way, by means of your analysis, to discriminate the role played by Mauro Lanza from one hand and the role played by Andrea Valle from the other? Because this is a collaborative piece, I think.
It's quite uncommon.
It's an excellent
music.
question, and I think they purposefully, in their interviews, I just talked with Mauro, but they obscure that. However, he said to me, oh, the harmonic part, if you listen to that, ircam, that's how, that's my harmonic process, which suggests that he's responsible for that, and that Valle is responsible. And then Valle is known for working for several years with rumentarium, and that suggests that there might be a clearer division of labor than they present when they present this work together. So,
thank you.
Yeah, that was my question as well, if I may. Perhaps a way to address that would be to situate this piece with respect to some other Lanza and Valle works, and especially perhaps the early Lanza pieces like Barocco. These pieces in which the quasi-mechanical, as you call it, is really appears for the first time, and perhaps the harmony is much more linked to the late Lanza. But I guess we would have kind of we could see kind of hybrid of their separate works. I don't know.
yeah, I spent a long time trying to figure out how the 5 pieces related to the orchestral piece, because at first it was not evident. And then I just started kind of, I mean, you heard what I've come up with. But it isn't absolutely evident, so it's hard to tell. However, the string trio in the Regnum is very explicitly, as I said, notated. And there's this great, I don't know how many people here are familiar with this, the patafix strings supposedly produce 3 and 4 overtones, but again, that's kind of in the realm of the ideal, the Platonic. It's hard to tell if all of those notes are really sounding, but he writes a note in the score that says, pitches are important. So.
Okay, that's a good quote to take away for the coffee time. Thank you very much.